All right. Good afternoon, Smart Building Exchange, and welcome to our panel. We're super excited to spend a little bit of time today on the topic of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, and more in particular, losing the acronym and improving the result. Let's focus on results. Let's focus on progress is kind of the idea of today's session. And we have just a spectacular group of panelists to support that discussion today and really try to focus on the future. And with respect to the topic of ESG, sometimes it's politicized, sometimes it's divisive. We see lawsuits out there. We see corporations and public entities proclaiming goals around environmental progress or social progress. We see headlines around it. And what we're going to do today is dive into some real world examples, focused around partnerships, focused around organizations working together to make progress. How is that progress measured with data and analytics in a way that hopefully is real world, and in a way that hopefully each of you as audience members can take away back to your respective organizations. So a little bit about how today will be administered. First and foremost, please submit your questions. We have the question and answer module open in the Zoom meeting, so feel free along the way to input your questions, and we'll do our best to get to those throughout and or at the end of the content. A little bit about myself before we dive in. My name is Jeff Hughes. I represent an organization, the McKinstry Company. We've been an organization for about 65 years, and we are a solutions provider across energy efficiency, renewable energy, consultative services to decarbonize the built environment, to help build the infrastructure of the future and the energy transformation. So that's a little bit about my background and the company I represent as the honored moderator for today. We're going to cover, going back to the agenda here, we're going to cover the takeaways a little bit up front as a sneak peek to what we're going to cover in the panelist discussion. So we hope to kind of feed your brain a little bit before we dive into the details with each of our panelists. We'll introduce the panelists, of course, before we start, and then we'll have a great discussion. We have some prepared questions, and again, please submit those questions along the way. So today, before we dive into the individual introductions, the panelists that we have: Drew Halpern from Denver's Climate Office. We have Scott Morsey from the Denver International Airport, and Josie Hart from Denver Botanical Gardens. So representing the great state of Colorado today. Before we dive in, I wanted to share a little bit about macro trends that we see on the ESG topic in the market today. First and foremost, from an investment standpoint, lots of money is being poured into the market. And notice I said the word investment, $33 trillion worth of work deployed by 2026. That's across public, private organizations, and that's a global figure. The second icon here we have is, noting that the US and North America is trailing behind in this space. Now, we've made a lot of progress lately with the Inflation Reduction Act. There's lots of great policy that's being made across the country, but the opportunity ahead of us is great, and one we should be excited about in terms of making that progress. And lastly, purpose-driven organizations are growing at a faster rate than profit-driven organizations only. There's some data to support that. It's probably controversial, but I think it's fair to say that generationally, our clients, our stakeholders, our constituents are demanding responsible activity, whether it's related to the environment, whether it's related to social equity. More and more people are demanding responsible answers and responsible approaches of our organizations. So we wanted to share those macro trends to sort of set the table as we dive in. So a couple key takeaways we wanted to feed your brain with, as we said ahead of time. We think you're going to walk away from this session believing that ESG makes good business sense. It's not just a compliance regulated requirement or a mandate. We think that applied appropriately with the right mindset, the right planning, it can be good economic sense for organizations. We want to get away from this concept of greenwashing and the idea that, ESG is a political topic. I think, it might change over time what we refer to as ESG, but this work is happening in the market. It's working. And if you look at the changes companies are making around social equity, if you look at the changes organizations are making around climate progress and energy and efficiency and renewable energy, like change is happening, whether or not we want to call it ESG or something else. And so we would just kind of want to change this idea of greenwashing. Another thing we're going to hear today is about partnerships, and all the stakeholders today on today's panel, I think, believe strongly in partnerships, and you're going to hear about kind of that's a little bit of the secret sauce of what's making some of this work across the country. And as I mentioned before, ESG does make business sense. We believe that. We hope to convince you by the end of this panel. So let's go ahead and dive in. And Drew, if we could kind of start with you, if you'd be willing to introduce yourself, give us a little bit of taste of the organization you represent and the great work that you're doing.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jeff. My name is Drew Halpern, and as Jeff introduced, I work for Denver's Office of Climate Action. We have a much longer name, Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency, which gives a little bit of an indication of what we work on. A little bit of my background: I was trained as an engineer, and I came to the work I'm doing now almost by chance after a stretch in the oil field and then working on water wells and water pipelines. Getting really close to people and how my work impacted them really led me to take this leap over to the public sector and trying to work at that intersection of energy and climate action. Our agency is a very, very young one in a city that is over 160 years old. We just celebrated our 4th birthday. So we're the little tiny baby in a very big machine, but we were created specifically for that reason, to do the things that the other agencies can't do, not because they don't want to, but because they have so much other work and other entrenched needs. We're able to come in with a fresh look, fresh ideas, move nimbly to rapidly and equitably decarbonize our city. We want to adapt to the impacts of climate change, and we also want to be ready for an all-electric, carbon-free future. So you'll see kind of 6 items that are highlighted on the slide. Those are what we call our allowable uses. By the laws that created our agency, we're kind of only allowed to do those 6 things. But our work is really wide-ranging. It goes all the way from building these, what we would consider relatively large scale for our city, community solar gardens, all the way to administering our Energized Denver building performance policy, all the way to planting trees in neighborhoods and working on workforce development programs or providing additional support staff to help those underserved communities within the city. We're lucky to have a dedicated funding source. Our taxpayers passed a 0.25% sales tax back in 2021. And that provides us a nice bucket of cash to work out of. Thanks, Megan. We were originally projected to collect about $40 million annually. We've actually collected well north of 50 each of the years that the sales tax has been in place. And that really gives us some really powerful advantages compared to some other local governments, perhaps. One is our funding is not impacted by other budget battles. We are not part of our city's general fund. So we can work outside of maybe the other political or practical strains that the city is experiencing. It allows us to hit the ground running. We are fully staffed, and we have projects and programs that were at the ready from day one. And then lastly, it really shows our constituents' commitment to our work, right? We have a mandate to go out into our community, find this work, and get it done. You can go to the next slide, Megan. We think about working to achieve our climate action goals through 4 tenets: policy, projects, partnerships, and programs. A lot of my work is on the lower half of this diagram, but we see policy as the way to create that widespread, lasting change. Programs can balance the benefits of the actions that the city takes. Projects really show what is possible. And then our partnerships are the only way we can actually make any of this work. We can't work out on an island by ourselves. We need the support of our community, and we need that support to roll uphill so that our council people and our mayor continues to back the projects that we work. Speaking of our projects, we do, like I said, quite a few different things, but under my team, these are our major areas of work: community solar and microgrids. So these are large scale, like again, for us, on the order of 1 megawatt is our largest sites. Community solar programs, 63% of all the energy we produce from those community solar arrays goes directly back to our community to support community members that need either direct support on their bills or through our Denver Housing Authority. We are also just starting to work on our first energy resiliency hub, where we will deploy a large-scale battery to be able to run a city facility off-grid in times of extreme emergency or extreme heat or extreme cold. We also lead the city's EV charging deployments. This is both on the public and fleet side. We want to reduce the barriers to electrifying transportation around our city. So that could be publicly available charging at all of our city sites, right-of-way charging, working with multifamily housing associations to build charging at their sites, as well as getting ahead of our city fleets such that they can have the charging where they need it, when they need it, so that they can buy those vehicles and we can stop burning as much fuel to get the job done for our city. Lastly, we are focusing on, how do we heat and cool the city well into the future? Specifically, my team is thinking about how do we heat the downtown buildings without steam as a source of heat. It is not an easy challenge. We are deep into a study right now, but we are looking to prove this with our city facilities first, so that we can then go out into the community and work on replicating this method with all of the other buildings owned by the public, along with Xcel Energy, our utility provider, so that we can make, possibly the greatest change to this city that I'll ever see in my lifetime, going to a carbon zero heating paradigm for our downtown area. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Drew. I have a question. You've been at this for, let's say, 4 years, I think you said, and it's a bit of a startup, right, within the city, and so very different, scope and core sort of competency that needs to be developed, and a diverse set of work that you're doing. Where do you start? If you're starting from the day one, like if we have an audience member out there trying to get started, do you have any tips or advice for, where does somebody start with something like this?
Yeah, Jeff, that's a great point. We very much think of ourselves as a startup within the city, which creates its own challenges sometimes. The thing that I would say is do the thing that is most visible and has the highest chance of success possible, right? You need to gain support, and people need to see the fruit of the labor in their community or in their organization, to build that momentum. So really thinking about what can I do quickly, effectively, and visibly, to make sure that you can get the okay to do project number 2 and 3 and 4.
Yeah, so I hear you saying demonstrate, success. And maybe one more question before we move on. Has there been any particular initiative that's resonated best, with the community for one reason or another?
Yeah, our community solar program, okay, there's really 2 things. One, we have gotten a lot of national press on our electric bike, our e-bike voucher program. So our agency has sponsored various levels of vouchers for folks in our community. We've given out 10,000 of these vouchers or so. I haven't really gotten an update on those numbers recently, but it has been a real crowd favorite. E-bikes are really a wave of the future for transportation within urban settings. The second one is our community solar program. It is very visible. People who aren't even necessarily subscribed to the arrays get a direct benefit by having shade and electric vehicle charging at recreation centers, for example, around the city. And we are also partnering with Denver Public Schools to deploy more of these community solar arrays, where we can develop curriculum and community programming around them.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that, and thanks for the introduction today, Drew. If I could, I'd like to bounce around next to Scott Morrissey from the Denver International Airport. And Scott, if you could spend a few minutes describing, who you are and the work that you're doing there over at the airport.
Yeah, of course. Good afternoon, everyone. We appreciate you having me here today. One of I think the unique parts of working at an airport is that there's generally not a lot of introduction that's required because I think people understand what airports do. But we're also pretty unique in the fact that, if you see a lot of statistics about the global impact of different industries on greenhouse gas emissions, aviation right now is actually relatively low on that list, just at a couple of percent. But the reason why the aviation sector is so focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions is that it is a particularly difficult to decarbonize industry. And so what we're going to see over time is that as the ground transportation sector and as the building sector both decarbonize more quickly, that percentage associated with aviation is going to continue to increase over time. We also certainly notice that in many parts of the world, specifically now in Europe, there's a lot of public pushback on aviation based on its carbon impacts. And so there's a group of many large airports that are really critically focused on what sustainability looks like within our industry and what we can do within our role within aviation to help push the industry forward. So if we can move to the next slide, I'll talk a bit about what our approach to that is. We are already in Denver, one of the largest airports in the United States and the world. In 2023, we were at 77.8 million passengers, which put us actually number 3 in the United States and number 6 internationally. But we also recognize that just given the unique demographics of Denver and the unique characteristics of our site, sitting on 53 square miles northwest of the city and county of Denver, northeast of the city and county of Denver, we have a fairly unique opportunity to grow relative to a lot of large U.S. airports. And so in order to prepare for that growth, we have created what we call our Vision 100 strategic plan. You can see the 4 pillars of that strategic plan on the screen. And the reason why we're focused on Vision 100 is that it is our path to get our infrastructure and facilities prepared for growing to about 100 million passengers per year sometime before the end of this decade. What's really exciting for us is that because we are a municipally owned airport, so we are part of the city and county of Denver, just like the climate office that Drew represents. But between the commitments that the city and county of Denver have made and the commitments that our executive leadership team has made, sustainability and resiliency is actually one of 4 guiding principles that we have that guides all of the work that we're doing under this Vision 100 strategic plan. We can go to the next slide. I can talk a little bit more about that growth, because in most organizations, an increase in activity, and in our case, an increase in passenger activity, generally comes with a corresponding increase in environmental impacts. And this admittedly simple graph is, I think, just helpful for us to think about the challenge that our growth creates, namely the fact that before we start talking about how we're going to achieve the city and county's 2030 and 2040 greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals, we need to start by decoupling our growth from those environmental impacts. We're doing that in a number of different ways. We're doing that across a number of different environmental media. It's not just emissions, it's energy, it's water, it's waste. But we recognize that simply being more efficient, simply having fewer environmental impacts per million passengers is not going to be sufficient for us, and it's not going to be enough for our community. And so we have set very ambitious goals. We're committed to ensuring that all of the new construction that we build at Denver International Airport is as efficient as it possibly can be. Right now, that looks like LEED Gold and LEED Platinum for all of our new facilities. But we also recognize that as we start getting closer to 2030, we're going to need to start to transition our growth projects from a LEED Platinum standard to actually getting as close to net zero energy and net zero emissions as we possibly can. Similarly, despite the fact that we're growing, we recognize that we have about 20 million square feet of existing facilities that we need to bring to a similar efficiency standard to our new construction. And so we're doing that, actually working with McKinstry, that Jeff is a member of their team, on a $83 million energy performance contract that through that single project is going to reduce energy use facility-wide by about 20%, reduce water use by 30%, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 30,000 metric tons each year. We're also really focused on renewable energy. Right now, we already have about 150 acres of solar photovoltaics installed on our campus. We did a project with the Denver's Climate Office for some of those to be community solar gardens that not only provide a sustainable energy benefit for the airport, but also support community solar deployments. But we're also really working closely with our local utility, as Drew mentioned, on both advocating for more less carbon intensive electricity being delivered, but also doing our part by electrifying some of those unique airport sources, whether it's passenger and employee vehicles, fleet vehicles, our busing operation, rental cars, airline ground support equipment. We have a wide variety of things that we have the potential to electrify, and we're trying to be proactive on that while still working with our local utility to ensure that we are having access to the amount of power that we need. And so when we think through what the future looks like, it's really important that we have the partnerships that we do with McKinstry, with the Kaiser office, with the Botanic Gardens as it relates to community solar, because we do recognize that we're part of a larger ecosystem, we are part of a larger community, and it's really impossible to get the progress on the scale that's required to achieve some of these really seemingly intractable societal efforts if we don't build these kinds of partnerships in. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Scott. It's really awesome work, and at a scale that's really interesting, right? That airports have so much of a potential to impact. I see that your first ESG report issued was published just about a year ago or so, or on the year of 2023, so I guess early this year. ESG is often associated with the private sector, right? With, let's say, SEC compliance and so forth, and the public sector is a little bit more like self-regulated or less regimented, so to speak. How did you think about measuring results and KPIs and collecting the right data to know the progress that you're making and put out a report like that? Like, what do you report on and why? How did you think
it was
about
something that we really gave a lot of thought to before we actually started moving forward with ESG reporting specifically. And I think what it came down to for us is, recognizing, the fact that there is a certain amount of political sensitivity around ESG reporting, especially, I think, in the private sector. Ultimately, we are a community asset, highly visible. Oftentimes, the first interaction that visitors to Denver might have with the city and the state is at Denver International Airport. And we felt like it was very important in that context, both to be transparent with the community about, the progress that we've been making, but also some of the challenges that we have. And I think it was actually the fact that we are a public sector entity that made ESG reporting so important to us. It was an opportunity for us on an annual basis. We're actually getting ready in the next several weeks to release our 2023 ESG report, but to be able to share, both the values of our organization, which we think our values that mirror those of our community, but then also have that opportunity to be able to tell these stories in a little bit more of an integrated way than we might have previously from individual financial statements and governance statements and environmental statements. And so I'm personally of the opinion that working within the public sector, that community connection that we all have makes ESG reporting that much more important.
Yeah, thanks for that. And one other question I have, just with respect to airports, people have choices where to fly, and so maybe this is not totally correct, but maybe you kind of compete with other airports around the country and in some ways. And I wonder, do you see this work that you all are doing as a competitive advantage? Is that like an appropriate sort of, is it an investment burden? Is it a competitive advantage? Like, how do you sort of think about these investments related to your flyers and your passenger count?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it is a little bit different in the airport space than certainly it might be in the airlines part of the aviation sector. Other peer airports are certainly competitors in one context, right? Especially when you're thinking about connecting passengers, they have a choice in what airport they're going to connect through. We tend to have a very strong O&D, we call it origin and destination traffic. So people who are flying either from or to come to Denver. But I think the fact that there's not the same kind of direct economic competition between airports is actually great from a sustainability perspective, because it puts us into a perspective where I would say at this point, most major airports have very ambitious sustainability goals, very ambitious greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. And we actually have a pretty tight-knit community within the airport sector in which we go to conferences together, we have monthly meetings together where we talk about our successes and our challenges. And I think we're able to do that in a way that is much more collaborative than it is competitive, because of the fact that the competition is really along the margins. It's not the core part of the work that we do. And so we borrow great ideas from many major international airports. If people have questions for us, we share all the information we can, because ultimately the goal is to be able to decarbonize our industry. And we can only do that if we're working collectively and we're working across many different airports in many different parts of the country.
Yeah, I love that, back to this idea of partnership, right? And in this context, in the industry of aviation. So it's really cool to see, and great to hear that, you all are doing great work, but you're not the only one, right? There's lots of airports out there kind of working in that same direction together. And that's pretty exciting to hear.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Scott, for the introduction and the background on your work. If we could pivot now, I'd love to introduce Josie Hart from the Denver Botanical Gardens. And I will say I've been to the Denver Botanical Gardens, so I'm just going to do like a little bit of a shameless plug here. Very beautiful property. Would highly encourage you to go and visit if you haven't next time you're in Denver. So Josie, if you wouldn't mind, help the audience understand a little bit, what does the world look like from your perspective and on this topic, and what's some of the work that I think is going to be a little bit different and unique from the other panelists that we've heard from today.
Thank you, Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone from Denver, Colorado. Also, thanks to Drew and Scott. That amazing information and really a lot to think about there already. So yeah, I work with Denver Botanic Gardens. I am located at the Chatfield Farms location, which is just about 30 minutes outside Denver along the foothills. So we're at 6,500 feet elevation. And so farming that much elevation is a little bit of a challenge. But we really have started focusing on, sustainability, how to be regenerative. In 2020, we made a commitment, our farm, our 300-acre farm made a commitment to become regenerative. And so just like, a lot of the environmental and social governance reporting kind of tag words and hot button words, regenerative agriculture is one of those hot button words. And what does that really mean in terms of real change that we can create in the agricultural world? We follow a set of principles and guidelines for our farming methods, mainly focused on soil health, respecting indigenous wisdom, carbon storage for sure, and I can talk a little bit about what carbon storage means on a farm. And also water use reduction. Obviously, Denver's very hot and very dry, and we have to irrigate regularly to have healthy crops. But what are the systems we can put in place to use less water? And we sort of have a little saying that we use in regards to water stewardship, which is basically slow it down, spread it out, and soak it in. And we really try to follow that on a daily basis with our farming operations, and also for horticulture, also for conservation and restoration that we have going on in the farm. We try to restore ecosystems back to native prairie, and that means also being good water stewards. We also focus on food in terms of regenerative agriculture. We want to feed communities that otherwise wouldn't have access to organic, fresh food. So we've really leveraged a lot of our partners to reach out and to help us get the food out there. We can grow the food, we can focus on the way that we're growing the food, but we need our partners to be able to connect to communities to give access for that food. So that's also something that we really focus on a lot.
Awesome. And yeah, thanks for sharing that. I noticed, I was kind of browsing your website a little bit. Oh, sorry if I'm jumping in here. I didn't know if that was your last slide. I was going to ask about the sort of the community a little bit more, a little bit deeper, but maybe this is a good transition to this slide.
Sure. So we are a part of the community solar project that Drew oversees and was talking about. This project started 3 years ago. We were approached actually first by NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, to potentially think about an agrivoltaics system out at our farm. And it sounded pretty intimidating to me in the beginning because farming is really difficult as it is. And then having to kind of, weave your way through a bunch of metal structures that are moving and oscillating, following the sun seemed really pretty crazy to me, in full disclosure. And I went out to Jack's Solar Garden, which is located in Longmont, and just kind of checked it out to see if it's something that we could look into. And really, I was quite surprised at the benefits that I was already seeing just walking the site. The shade provided the plants a chance to kind of rebound from the super intense Colorado sun. People who were farming at Jack's were reporting using less water because of the shade and the cooling effects to the soil and to kind of the ambient temperature underneath the panels. And also I was really interested by the dual use of agrivoltaics for farmers. Of course, as a farmer growing crops, you're trying to make as much money as you can on those crops. But when you look at being able to make money also with energy savings or selling solar credits and growing and raising crops, that seemed like a really interesting idea to me. And part of what we do with Denver Botanic Gardens is we provide examples and displays to the rest of the community here and nationally on how farmers can really leverage their land and leverage their resources to have the best outcome for sustainable agriculture in general. And so the idea that we could be farming in the soil and still growing in ground, which I'm very, very passionate about. I love soil grown food. I think it tastes better and it has a lot more nutrient content than hydroponic food. And also, just really providing that example to people who come to the Denver Botanic Gardens and Chatfield Farms to learn about smarter ways to manage their land and to be land stewards. And I think when we're talking about regenerative agriculture, really what we're talking about is how do we manage our land in a way that encompasses the entire ecosystem of that land. And so while I can't really store carbon and draw down carbon in an annual system where I'm harvesting crops every single day and I'm ripping them out of the soil and I'm pulling that carbon back up out of the soil, I can plant windrows full of, diverse trees and native plants that will sequester the carbon over the long term. And so every farmer really is not just focusing on raising a carrot, but it's being a land steward and encompassing the ecosystem to really create a healthy system. And not to use the word that we use too much these days, but really resilient agriculture. How can we continue to farm in 30 years from now, when we know it's going to be hotter, we know it's going to be drier? What are the solutions that we're coming up with now, and really just honing in those systems to be able to teach other farmers that this is a viable option. So I've already had a lot of interest from people reaching out to me, wanting to know more about how they could have agrivoltaics on their farm. And so we right now are in the process of setting up a tour program where we're going to lead farmers and, backyard enthusiasts and everyone in the sector who wants to know more about agrivoltaics out to our system to teach them more, to show them sort of up close and personal the benefits and how to do it. And we really are taking the whole project very almost like a sacred endeavor to try to provide solutions for farming into the future, because we know that it's getting more difficult. We now have a heat plan on our farm for when farmers are outside and they've been exposed to high temperatures for more than 4 hours. What do we do about that? How do we keep people healthy and protected from the sun? And every time we're giving a tour or we're working out into the solar array, we notice that it's cooler, and we notice that people like to stay in the solar array a little bit longer than maybe they would in some of the other fields. And so that right there is evidence that we're creating something that's sustainable for humans as well. And that's the most important thing.
Well, this is just really awesome and unique work that you all are doing at the Botanic Gardens. And I wonder, we may have some folks, cities or municipal entities on the call, or even private companies or individual community members. What does it take to get started with something like this? Implementing a program, do you have to boil the ocean, or is there like a step 1 and 2? Besides, it sounds like joining your new tour, but besides that, what's on your mind in terms of how you coach somebody to think about starting a regenerative program like this?
Well, I can start first, but I know Drew has a lot of ideas about this too, because we've worked so closely together. I think really getting the right people in the right room. For me, directly starting this conversation about this project, I was inspired by NREL. I was inspired by what Jordan Macknick had to say about agrivoltaics being an option for farmers to kind of continue farming into the future. So that getting the right people in the room for me was also learning more about the Climate Protection Fund and what CASR is doing. In particular, Drew's team and Jonathan Rogers, who we've worked with at the city as well a lot, just seeing how inspired and passionate they were about action. So not just about sustainability, but climate action, right? What are we going to do about these problems, and how are we going to remove the barriers and get rid of those roadblocks to really create change now and to get things done? And so being in the right room with the right people who are focused on outcomes and action, I think for me was the most important part as a farmer and as a doer, someone who's outside doing. I can get pretty, bored quickly by people who just want to talk a big game and people who want to shoot numbers and charts and all sorts of gizmos and gadgets at me. And I want to go out and I want to do it, and I want to see the change, and I want to be a part of that change. And I think CASR has really been probably one of the most shocking or surprising offices that are out there doing it and not just talking about it. So I think it starts with the people, and it starts with the trust that people want to do.
Yeah, I can't agree more. Josie, people really do make the difference. The one thing I will add is, some folks on the webinar right now might be thinking like, why are we listening to these people? And part of what, I wanted to come on and do is challenge folks, like, you have to think outside the box. If all we're doing is doing the subtraction of how much energy you're consuming and how many RECs we can buy and trying to get that number as low as possible, like, we are not we are not making a difference. And really thinking about how do you connect with your local community, the greatest impact you can make is is what you can see, right? So working in your local community, finding out what your local needs are and how can you create local partnerships to deliver on those needs. Like that is a necessary paradigm shift about how we have to think about our relationship to sustainability and similar type of work.
Yeah, go
Um,
ahead, Scott.
I think what really resonated with me about what Josie said was, and it's something that we actually struggle with a bit at the airport, because there's so many business partners, so many stakeholders within our ecosystem. And the point that I always try to make when we're launching a new program is that we want to make it as easy as possible for our business partners to do the right thing and to do the thing that we are encouraging them to do. And it's exciting to hear about the relationship between the Climate Office and the Botanic Gardens, because it sounds like the Climate Office is really able to do that and to be able to communicate the values for people who might have, they might be committed to sustainability, but they have other priorities too. And the ability to find that alignment of values, but then also to make it easier for them to say yes, is like really critical to get any of these kinds of projects off the ground.
And we had a question a little bit about the topic of buying RECs or offsets. Scott, I wonder, from the airport's perspective, most large entities would consider this as sort of an easy path to, if you want to call it decarbonize or comply. How do you think about that as compared to, say, some of the more, tactical project work, efficiency program, on-site programs, community programs? Can you talk a little bit about how you think about that?
Yeah, it's a really important question, because there is a path to decarbonization on paper, I would say, that might look very different than decarbonization in actuality. And again, I think it's one of the real benefits that we have of being connected to Denver's Climate Office. We've made a community commitment that our goal is to achieve decarbonization without the use of offsets. And I do want to be careful, because offsets are a tool that have value in certain situations. And I think especially as maybe a gap strategy in the way to achievement of long-term goals. But this question really resonates with me specifically because we struggle a bit because we participate in our local utility solar energy program. And because of the state level renewable energy portfolio standards that are in place in Colorado, we generally cannot benefit from the renewable energy credits that are generated from our projects. And so some might make the argument to say, well, then why are you doing solar if you can't claim the emissions benefits? And the point that we're making is that there is an inherent value in having solar energy being produced directly feeding our facility, offsetting some of that cost and offsetting, some of that energy that would otherwise be used. And again, as a public organization, the fact that you can drive into Denver International Airport or take the train into Denver International Airport and see solar panels, or you can fly in or fly out and see, 100+ acres of solar panels on the ground. We feel like that message and that regional clean energy development is actually just as important as the greenhouse gas emissions accounting. And so, we're certainly focused on RECs and, focused on high quality RECs as an accountability mechanism, but we don't want that to get in the way of actually going out and doing the important work.
Yeah, I love that perspective, and thanks, Scott. I think we have time for one more question, and somehow we've already burned through 45 minutes. So, Drew, if I could give this one to you, the core mission, what's so impressive to me about this group of panelists is the core mission of each respectively is not, to go out and execute per se, like the city of Denver is to take care of their citizens, or the airport is to facilitate travel, or Botanic Gardens to facilitate farming and regenerative farming. But it's not necessarily executing on ESG scope as a core mission. How do you balance sort of call it the core business whether you're in like a specific group that focuses on it or not, but just at large, how do you think about that, Drew, like balancing with the rest of the responsibilities of the city?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to try and, parallel kind of what we are doing as a city and what a lot of private corporations and other groups will be doing out in their own work. It comes down to like showing the benefit of your work to that core mission. Everything has to be additive, and can't really be distractive, right? And so everything we do, we have detractors. We have people telling us that what we're doing is not good for the city overall, and we try to come back to them and say, no, we actually believe what we're doing is making our city more affordable over time, more attractive to businesses to come and set up shop here. It's going to be able to keep the people who are already here in their homes. So we're speaking directly to our leaders' needs, both within our agency and in the city in general. But really making sure we're always, coming back to what is the value of the work that we're doing. It's not just, a count of something on a page that goes in a file. Like real things have to come out of our work that make the work valuable to continue to invest in over time.
Yeah, if I could add a bit to that, I have some experience working, in the city and county of Denver for many years now. And, I think to the point of the question, community response to sustainability has, been different over the course of time. And I think one of the real benefits of the work that we do in sustainability is it really is a big tent concept. And so the more that we can talk about, the co-benefits of climate action in particular, it becomes really easy to get people to buy into what you're doing. Because even if there is a certain political sensitivity around climate action, for example, you still have the opportunity to talk about local air quality benefits. You still have the opportunity to talk about, as the great point that Drew made of making Denver a more affordable community. And so you might actually be able to find some common ground with people, even if they feel like they're not supportive of climate action by name, by connecting it to all of those other concepts that are much more broad community values. You can bring them into the sustainability conversation at the same time.
Yes, I would love to jump in and just talk quickly about co-benefits for agrivoltaics and working with Drew's team. So, the agrivoltaic system at Chatfield is donating 80% of the power generated to low-income families. And we were really inspired by that idea and decided, well, what if growing the plants underneath the solar panels is not just going to go into our CSA program or some of our existing market channels, but what if we donate all of the produce that we grow in that 5 acres? And so we are now working with the city of Denver, city council people to identify families that are food insecure that would be interested in a summer CSA grown in the solar panels. And we're going to be donating all 5 acres of the produce grown. So those co-benefits are, going toward the city of Denver, people who need energy assistance, people who need food assistance, but then also for us, being able to grow food in a healthy way and more of a sustainable way for our farmers and for less water usage on our farm is a benefit to us. And I think, we had a lot of resistance from the community for the solar array going in because people could see the solar panels from their porches and from their decks and everything like that. But slowly, as people understand what those true benefits are to the community, they're hopping on board to support the solar array. And they're even asking, how can they donate money? How can they donate time to volunteer? How can they be a part of this movement to support the sustainability around them in their own neighborhoods? So I think it's really when you put the rubber to the road and you get some action, people start saying, yes, you are real. You guys are legitimate. You guys are really doing this and you're benefiting the community, and other people kind of feel that and then take part in it too.
No, that's great insight. And quick housekeeping, I was mistaken. We have another 25 minutes or so. So false alarm. Thanks for clarifying to the admin on the call. You know, each of you talked a little bit about partnership and the importance of that. And you know, we see the panelists are all in Denver and have some kind of ties, you know, working together. I don't know, Josie, maybe first, you want to talk a little bit about, you know, how does that work, you know, in terms of how you see, you know, your work integrating on this topic with the airport, with the Denver Climate Office, or just in general, you know, how do you think about partnership to accomplish your goals?
Yeah, so I mean, the name is community solar, right? We're all participating in a community that cares about our climate. And the fact that we can be directly in partnership in a community with DIA, with the airport, with the city of Denver, you know, I think it's understanding that climate action is a much bigger umbrella and web than we think it is. You know, how does a small, you know, sort of botanic garden or farm outside Denver relate to the airport or relate to the city of Denver? Well, because the climate and the health of our planet and the health of our people all connect back to the same mission. And if we're talking about food security and we're talking about people who are hungry, you know, providing them food momentarily isn't addressing the problem. But if we're all getting to the root of why the climate is changing and why we need to make changes in our own lives and connect to each other as a community, as we start to address those root problems, we realize that they're all connected. And so partnerships and strategic partnerships are addressing the same things because we ultimately have the same baseline and the same goal for our organizations to help our planet and help our people. So it just seems really easy to me to make those connections. But I think the more we can report this type of work and our impacts out to the community in a lot of different ways, people start understanding that the climate is a much bigger connection than just simply, you know, driving your car less or trying to electrify your home, but really, you know, food, water, resources, it's all connected together. And I think the city of Denver is pretty inspiring because we have been able to have a coherent conversation together on how to address these problems.
That's great. I appreciate that. I don't know, Drew or Scott, do you want to chime in on this idea of partnerships? I know you touched on it a little bit, but anything come to mind, either one of you?
Yeah, I can hop in. You know, we think of partnerships as like the way we keep this thing going, right? Like as we can get people invested into the outcomes of what we do, we can gain more momentum, we can spread our wings a little bit wider. And I think that same thing translates out into the private sector, right? And again, coming back to this idea of we have to think outside the box. We have to invest in real projects like in our local communities. It does take more work. It would be easier if I just went out and convinced somebody in the city to buy a new parcel of land and I didn't have to have the meetings with Josie and Scott and talk with people and work to other people's specifications and rules sometimes, but the projects are better, you know, and they have more impact and there's a more compelling story that we can tell. And by having, you know, this past experience to point to say, hey, like we've worked with these other types of folks, like, do you want to work with us too? We bring more people into that, you know, that big tent as Scott was mentioning. You know, it also helps us find what the needs are, you know, by creating partnerships and just like having those relationships. We can have a better sense of like what is actually needed and get outside of our own box a little bit, our own thinking. Sometimes when we're just in the climate office, it's a little bit of an echo chamber and like we need that outside influence. And I would think that is probably similar, you know, in other groups and companies around.
And I talked quite a bit about stakeholders earlier, so I might just add that, you know, an interesting statistic about airports is that When you think about even the size of our facility, which is truly massive, again, 20 million square feet of facilities, 53 square miles. When you think about our scope 1 and 2 emissions, so the direct control of the airport versus our scope 3 emissions, our scope 1 and 2 emissions are less than 10% of the total for as big as that number actually is. And so I think there's really resonance with that concept. I know certainly across the rest of the city, but the amount of progress that any individual person or even any individual organization can make on their own really is very limited in the scope of the changes that we need to make. And so I just always like to remind myself of that because, in an airport context between airlines and rental cars and concession partners and everyone else, we really need to build that support. And, if we can't convince, people who are within our organization that what we're doing is valuable, how are we ever going to convince people outside of it? And so, hopefully we can all think about, who are the people within our spheres that we really need to engage with, because like we just talked about with the community solar garden project, the collective impact is always going to be much more significant than what we can do on our own.
Yeah, I love, Josie, what you had said earlier about, the climate connecting all of us. And, I've been part of energy projects for the last 15 years in various forms. And, what you all are doing is truly special. And that extra effort of really integrating the community that you're describing today in different ways, right? From regenerative farming to, benefits to folks in the city and so on. It is just like the icing on the cake in terms of, what makes these projects most impactful. And it's, it's extra effort, but it's not like leaps and bounds beyond what's already being done to do a regular project. And that's what I think is so impactful and neat about what you all are doing is sort of like the great impact as a result of just thinking about it a little bit more critically and thoughtfully, so outside of the box, as you say, Drew. Here's a fun question for folks. ESG, the topic, a little bit divisive, sometimes referred to or seen as greenwashing. A few of you mentioned there's, naysayers out there in terms of, is this actually good? Is this a good investment? We have to listen to all perspectives and respect all perspectives out there. How do you think about handling that sort of feedback and addressing it within your organizations? And maybe Drew, start with you.
Yeah, sure. I think there's two things. One, like if there are concerns, like you have to take them seriously and hear them and allow people to like raise their concern and not, push it away. Like that's one. And I think that is just like, as a public servant, that's how we approach all of our work. And I think more folks should try and do that in their own. The second thing is like, you have to learn how to tell a story. I'm very lucky that I have a super talented communications group that I can just have a meeting with and say, hey, I want to tell this story. And they come up with a great way to do it. But knowing that, you're actually making a real difference, like I said earlier, keeping it local is the best way to make sure that the impact you intend to have is actually being seen on the ground. And then telling that story in a compelling way, and not just making it into, like I said, just some arithmetic that we can put on a piece of paper. We can make these things much more compelling and personal, and really understand what the value is of both either the money or the effort that we're spending on this type of work.
Yeah, and maybe speaking specifically about our instance, because we do have a formal ESG reporting program at the airport now. Maybe it's one of the benefits that we all have of being part of the public sector. But honestly, I think there's real resonance even within the private sector, that when we talk about ESG, we really go out of our way to talk about the S and the G as much as we talk about the E. And that kind of integrated messaging is really valuable for people, because now you're taking it away from, potential concerns about, greenwashing or something like that. And you're talking about it in the context of good governance. And, ultimately, ESG is all about transparently reporting the progress of your organization, but it's also about comprehensive risk management. I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about, what are the risks to our organization and how are the programs that we are implementing helping to mitigate that in some way. And so, that could be on the environmental side of, the risks associated with the changing climate and the steps that we are taking to make air travel, something that can be preserved into the future. But again, it's also on, the economic side as well. Like, we are a large economic driver of the airport, and we have a responsibility to grow in a sustainable way so that we can continue to be that economic driver for the decades into the future. And on the social side, there's a lot of industries that are struggling to find talent. We just announced what we're calling the Center for Equity and Excellence in Aviation. And it is a whole program on the social sustainability side about how do we build both the employees from K through 12 education that are going to, at some point, have the skill sets to have good jobs in the aviation sector, but then also how do we support women and minority-owned businesses within the region to be able to build the skill sets they need to be able to work in an aviation environment. And so when you think about things in that comprehensive context, now suddenly it's not just about sustainability, it's not about climate action, it's not about things that people might have an inherent political view on. You're talking about things of how do you make your organization resilient for the future and to be successful, just as successful 10 and 20, 30 years out into the future as we hope to be today.
Yeah, thanks for that, Scott. And Josie, anything from your end on this front?
I'm trying to remember what your original question was now, because I think we just went really far there. And I just started thinking about, social sustainability as well. I had a story that popped up into my head when you asked the question. And so, because Drew likes stories, I'll just do it real quick. We had our Farm to Fork dinner. That's an annual event that brings in our shareholders, and they donate money to our farm to help us with our operations. And I was talking about climate change and just being better as farmers and as an organization to address some of these problems that we're facing and challenges, and trying to create a place where we can provide an example for solutions for people to come and get inspired and to say, hey, like, I can tackle this. This is not a huge problem. This is something I can do in my backyard or with my home or with my family. And so we were really fired up about sustainability and climate action. And I get to the end of my speech and people are like, yeah, like, let's go out and do this. And someone walks up to me and says, well, I have an empty can here. I need to throw it away. Where's your recycling bin? And someone had forgotten to put the recycling bin out. And in that moment, I felt like such a fraud. I felt like, oh my gosh, here I am firing everyone up about climate action. And I'm not even recycling our cans. Like, what? I need to just go home and give this up. And I reminded myself that these problems are massive and that we can get really overwhelmed with the terminology and with the implications of these ideas. And we expect people who care to solve all the problems all at once. And that's not fair and it's not realistic. And we need to remember that as people who are involved in this type of work, we need to tackle what we can tackle, and we need to try to include as many people into the solutions as possible, but also just to remember that we can't solve every single problem simultaneously, and that this work is hard and it takes a long time to accomplish real change. And so just to kind of go a little bit easier on ourselves. And I think the more vulnerable we are in that conversation, the more the rest of the community understands that they can also do something to help our environment and to sort of make these massive changes that are needed.
I love that story, by the way. I think it's super relatable, in terms of the difficulty and, at the end of the day, we're not perfect organizations. We're not perfect people. These are huge challenges. And so I think you hit the nail on the head that, it's a big challenge and to tackle. So thanks for sharing that. I was going to ask each of the panelists today, lot of success from my perspective, looking at the work that each of you are doing respectively. Maybe a biggest challenge, anything you'd like to share along the way that's been a particular challenge for you all and how you got through. Maybe let's start with, go around the Robin, start with Scott and Drew.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge that we're facing now is really just getting to scale. Part of this is the cliche about, the last 20% being the hardest, but we're to the point now where, we have had a formal sustainability program at Denver International Airport for, 15 plus years. And it's got moved over time from, what was pretty, ad hoc and opportunistic of individual projects to, now, between our, solar programs and our energy programs and some of the other things that we're doing. I mean, we're really getting to the scale that we need to. But then you think about the next phase of the challenge, which is, you can't just talk about zero emissions. You need to figure out how to actually get individual organizations and individual cities and, ultimately society as a whole as close to net zero emissions as possible. And, to the point that Josie just made, like it's hard work. I mean, if there was simple answers, we would have done this all many decades ago. But trying to figure out how do you, make the right decisions on the technology front? How do you find, the projects that are going to be most worthwhile? It can be a challenge. And so, we try to think about it in the context of, what they talk about with rocks. We start with the big rocks. I think we have a good sense of, what the big rocks are. It's, our renewable energy program, it's our efficiency program, it's some of the other things that we're doing. But we also need to start, pivoting now to what are the things that are going to help to fill in. And then you get the smaller rocks and the sand that you put in on top of it. I don't think we have those things all figured out now. But it's important that we all start thinking about, once we get through, these phases of getting projects to scale, what are the activities that we really need to do to actually get to the ultimate end goal, which I think for most of us is, going to be net zero operations.
Yeah, thanks for that. Drew, you have any challenges you'd like to share that kind of gone through?
Yeah, I'd say Scott probably stole my answer in a lot of ways, but making the translation from doing this work in the public sector to making it accessible to other folks in their work, folks who are really focused on their ESG reporting and trying to make it something that is real. How can we leverage being a little bit ahead of the curve here at the city of Denver to making that at scale change throughout all industries, every sector, everywhere, is really can be very overwhelming. The other thing is just we can't really make mistakes in what we do. It is hard to build momentum, and it's really easy to stop it. And I'm very thankful that there are a lot of efforts, especially in the private sector, to make these a normal part of business. But we are making a lot of bets, and we have to make sure that we can collect on them. We will make mistakes. There will be small failures, but we have to try and make sure that they are small and just continue the forward progress, basically, at all costs.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. And Josie, any challenge you'd like to share with the group?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest challenge every day of my life is just that there's not enough hours in every day. And I think everyone can relate to that, and Scott said it perfectly. It's just determining the bigger boulders that you wanna deal with. And it's all the other little small things that have to fall into place to really get that momentum. I think for agrivoltaics, the challenge is the understanding that it's a dual use system. I think some people get really fired up that we should be covering all of our parking lots before we're touching farmland for these types of structures going in, right? And that's something that there's no easy conversation to be had. It's not really just a marketing campaign that you can put, well, it does this, this, and this, and people understand. It's having conversations. And when you're talking about vast miles of farmland across our country, how do you have those conversations to scale with enough people that can truly understand that it is about dual use? So I think Scott summarized it perfectly. It's really just how do we scale these things and how do we have enough time in each day to make an impact?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Maybe one more question I have for the group before we wrap up, and I think this time it's actually the end here in 5 minutes. So, what are you excited about? What are you looking forward to doing next? If you look ahead, look to the future, what is your organization excited about as you continue your path of success? Maybe we'll go in the same order here, just keep it simple.
Yeah, I think the thing that I am most excited about is, what I talked about before, right? Growth comes with a lot of potential risks, but it also really comes with a lot of opportunities as well. And I think we have as much momentum for our sustainability programs as we ever have. And I'm really just excited to see what we can do to leverage some of these opportunities. I mean, we are talking about, truly facility and community defining projects that are going to be built over the next 5 or 10 or 15 years. And I get really excited personally to think about, if we build, a new, expansion to the airport, and it is an entirely net zero emissions construction project, that's, national, international news. And I think it goes to just demonstrate, that, we're putting our money, where our mouths are, and, we're taking this seriously. And so I think we have all of the pieces in place to do that successfully. I'm just excited to see, what we're able to do next.
Before we keep going on that line, we do have a couple audience questions, if that's okay. I want to make sure to get to those. And somebody asks, is battery energy storage part of DEN's energy savings contract?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. So battery storage is not specifically part of the energy performance contract, but it is something that we are working on. We actually have a really exciting project that, again, is being done in coordination with our local utility, Excel Energy, through their community resiliency initiative, in which we're installing a 2.2 megawatt, 4.4 megawatt hour battery energy storage system that's going to provide backup power to our interconcourse train system. So the train that takes passengers between our terminal and concourses. We feel like there's a lot of great applications for battery energy storage systems in an airport. Everything from emergency generators, getting them off of diesel and natural gas, but also just in terms of broader microgrid concepts, improving power quality, things like that. So yeah, not specifically through EPC, but we're really excited about battery storage in the future.
I have a question here. This one's a little tricky maybe to interpret, but the question is, what about ESG for investors? What qualities would you recommend looking for in ESG investments, resiliency, risk assessment, sustainability, et cetera? I think it's important to note, like, we can't give financial advice as a panel. We're not financial advisors, but maybe we can look at this question from the standpoint of, how does a particular entity look at investing in projects, something like that. Maybe we could answer it that way. Drew,
I'm happy to take the first crack of that one too, just because we have this conversation with investors and potential investors quite a bit. And
sure.
actually, I think in our case, it's one of the things that leads us to believe that we are on the right track with our ESG reporting, because we've gotten really valuable feedback from the investment community that it's the kind of information that they're looking for. And so we've had, our last couple of large bond issuances that we've done as an airport, we've tried in certain cases actually getting them formally scored as green bonds, in certain cases having more informal conversations. But my personal experience has been, 5-10 years ago, we were not getting those questions from potential investors. And now when our finance team is meeting with investors, they're asking our sustainability team to come along to be able to answer those questions, because the investors have specific questions about how sustainability is improving the long-term value of that investment. And so they're asking us questions about, how energy efficiency is going to make for a more predictable cost structure moving forward. They're asking questions about work that we're doing through a climate resiliency plan that we just kicked off, for how we are preparing our physical assets for the adaptation that's going to be required as the climate changes. And so, it's a great question, because I do think the investment community is paying a lot more attention, especially to those places that it's a specific connection of your project to business continuity and business operations.
Yeah, thanks for that, Scott. I think last question of the day here before we wrap up, Josie. Back to this idea of what are you excited about? You look forward into the future for your organization. What's on your mind?
Well, we are right in the middle of a master development plan to create some nice, smart buildings on our site, a visitor center, an education pavilion, a restaurant, and the agrivoltaic system coming into our farm right at the same time that we were starting to address the need for a lot more buildings and just development to happen on the farm really was a perfect synergy. And I think I'm really excited for more of those synergies. I think that Chatfield Farms in the next 20 years is going to become a beacon of light and hope, really, for people who want to manage their land in a way that answers some of these challenges in regards to water and heat and energy. And I want people, and I'm excited for people to come and to look for inspiration here. So I'm really just excited about leveraging the partnerships that we already have with the city of Denver and so many different departments to really create a viable solution, and if not, just some ideas for people on how to manage land and food and water. So yes, I am excited for the future of Chatfield and just for Denver in general.
Well, I'm looking forward to visiting and seeing the new buildings once they're ready to go. So, hey, a big thank you from everyone, including myself, to our panelists. Really awesome to hear about the great work that you're doing. So thanks again for sharing with everybody here. Thanks to the audience members for joining in the questions today. Really appreciate you joining this session and participating. And finally, thanks to Smart Building Exchange, Smart Building Center for hosting this panel. This wraps up the day for the conference. So thanks again, everybody. We're all wrapped up here, and have a safe and enjoyable afternoon. Thanks, everyone.